Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Thursday, March 19th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. Today in Riverside, we are expecting a high of 97.8 degrees and a low of 69.2 degrees. With temperatures peaking that high, please make sure to stay hydrated and seek shade if you are spending time outside. On the program today, we are investigating the significant impact that recent attacks against Qatar have had on global energy security. We will also examine the current economic landscape as the national debt of the United States surpasses $39 trillion. Along with those major topics, we have plenty of other stories to cover in this broadcast. All this and more coming up on Alex's News, so stay tuned. We begin this morning with a crisis that is reshaping the global energy landscape in real time. Over the past 48 hours, Iranian ballistic missiles have struck Ras Laffan industrial city in Qatar, the single largest liquefied natural gas export hub on the planet. The damage is severe, and the ripple effects are already being felt worldwide. Ethan covers energy security and geopolitics for us, and he's been tracking this around the clock. Ethan, walk us through what happened.
This unfolded in two distinct waves. Grace, Al Jazeera and Reuters both report that the first wave hit on the evening of March 18th, targeting the Pearl GTL facility, which is a massive gas-to-liquids plant jointly run by Shell and Qatar Energy. Then early this morning, a second wave struck multiple LNG liquefaction units, causing what Qatar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs called, quote, significant damage, end quote, along with sizable fires. We're talking about the facility that supplies roughly 20% of the world's LNG, and right now that supply is effectively gone.
Now, there had already been some kind of disruption at Ras Laffan earlier this month, right?
That's an important distinction, and the Associated Press and the International Energy Agency have both been stressing it. Back on March 2nd, a drone hit a water tank at a nearby facility in Mesaid, and Qatar shut down production at Ras Laffan as a precaution. So the valves were already turned off. But what happened in the last 48 hours is fundamentally different. Bloomberg cites experts who explained it this way before. The valves were closed, but the infrastructure was intact. Now the infrastructure itself is broken.
How long are we talking before they can rebuild?
That's the truly alarming part. The second wave destroyed critical components called air separation units at the Pearl GTL plant. Bloomberg reports those units have manufacturing lead times of 3 to 4 years, so parts of this complex may not come back online until close to the end of the decade. Qatar Energy has officially declared force majeure, which means they're telling buyers worldwide they cannot fulfill their contracts due to circumstances beyond their control.
What prompted Iran to do this?
The immediate trigger was an Israeli strike yesterday on Iran's South Pars gas field near Asaluya. Here's the crucial geological detail that The Guardian and Eurasia Review have both highlighted. South Pars and Qatar's North Field, which feeds Ras Laffan, are actually the same underground reservoir split by a national border. So by hitting Ras Laffan, Iran engaged in what analysts call horizontal escalation. They targeted the energy infrastructure of Qatar, which has been a neutral mediator, to create enough global pain that the international community pressures Israel to stop.
And this is all happening during a broader American military campaign in the region?
Exactly. CNN and The Hindu report that this escalation is occurring alongside Operation Epic Fury, a U.S.-led campaign that began on February 28th. CENTCOM officials say they've struck over 7,000 targets inside Iran just this month, including the total destruction of Karg Island, which was Iran's primary oil export terminal. So Iran has already lost its own main revenue artery, and now it's lashing out at the energy infrastructure of its neighbors.
Was Qatar the only Gulf state targeted?
Not at all. NDTV and Bloomberg report this was a coordinated Iranian campaign across the Persian Gulf. The UAE had to shut down its Habshan gas facilities and the Bab gas field after debris from intercepted missiles threatened those sites. The UAE Ministry of Defense says it intercepted 13 ballistic missiles and 27 drones in the last 24 hours alone. Saudi Arabia says it thwarted drone attacks on the Samref refinery in Yanbu and a gas facility in its eastern province. And Kuwait Petroleum Corporation confirmed drone strikes on the Mina Al-Amadi refinery.
So Iran essentially went after the economic lifeblood of the entire Gulf in one coordinated push. What has President Trump said?
He posted on Truth Social with a pretty stark ultimatum. He claimed the U.S., quote, knew nothing, end quote, about the initial Israeli strike on South Pars, but he warned Tehran that any further hits on Qatari infrastructure would result in the U.S. military, quote, massively blowing up the entirety of the South Pars gas field, end quote. That threat carries enormous weight because Al Udeid Air Base, which is CENTCOM's forward headquarters, sits right there in Qatar and has already been targeted by Iranian drones and Zulfiqar missiles several times this month.
How has the broader diplomatic world responded?
There was already an emergency meeting of Arab and Muslim-majority foreign ministers happening in Riyadh, and Al Jazeera reports it shifted its entire focus to addressing the Iranian threat. The group issued what's being called the Riyadh Declaration, which characterized the strikes as a, quote, blatant violation of international law, end quote. And in perhaps the strongest diplomatic signal, Qatar declared the Iranian embassy's military and security attaches persona non grata, giving them just 24 hours to leave the country. That's a dramatic step from a nation that has long positioned itself as a go-between with Tehran.
Let's talk about the economic impact. What are energy markets doing right now?
It's been a shock to the system, Grace. Financial Post and NDTV report that Brent crude has surged past $115 to $117 per barrel. European natural gas prices have spiked 35%. And keep in mind, this isn't just about Ras Laffan being offline. The Strait of Hormuz remains under blockade, which means Qatar can't even export stored LNG, and the heavy machinery needed for repairs can't be shipped in by sea either. It's a compounding problem with no quick fix.
How is Europe handling this, given how dependent it's become on LNG since cutting ties with Russian gas?
European gas storage is sitting at a precarious 29%, which is dangerously low heading into what's left of the heating season. The EU is implementing what officials are calling energy triage. That includes mandatory 15% demand reductions across member states and a hard pivot toward what they're calling Atlantic origin LNG, primarily from the United States. But sourcing enough American LNG to replace what Qatar supplied is a massive logistical challenge that won't happen overnight.
And what about Asia? Countries like Japan and South Korea depend heavily on Qatari LNG.
Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have entered into what's being called a swap-and-share agreement. The idea is to reroute the few remaining incoming LNG tankers to whichever nation's storage hits critical lows first. It's essentially energy triage on the demand side. Analysts from Wood Mackenzie warn that this structural deficit probably won't be resolved until mid-2026 at the earliest, and the Global South will likely suffer the most from demand destruction caused by record-high prices.
There's also been a misinformation angle to all of this. What can you tell us?
BBC Verify has flagged a surge in AI-generated deepfake videos that appear to show missiles striking downtown Doha. Those are fabricated, but the damage at Ras Laffan itself is very real and has been independently confirmed by the IEA, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and major wire services, including Reuters. It's a reminder that in a crisis like this, bad actors will exploit the fog of conflict, and people really need to rely on verified reporting.
Where do things stand on the ground right now, as of this evening?
Qatari civil defense units have reportedly brought the fires at Ras Laffan under control, so the immediate danger appears to be subsiding. But controlling the fires and restoring production are two very different things. With those air separation units destroyed and a years-long rebuild ahead, the world is staring at a prolonged structural gap in its energy supply. And as long as the Strait of Hormuz remains contested, even the repair timeline is uncertain because you can't get the equipment in.
Ethan, this is an enormous story, and I know you'll be staying on it. Thank you for breaking all of that down for us.
Thanks, Grace. It's a fast-moving situation, and we'll keep updating throughout the day.
We do have one more story ahead this morning, so stay with us. We want to turn now to a major fiscal milestone that hit just 2 days ago. The national debt officially blew past $39 trillion on Monday. Chloe has been digging into how we got here so fast and what it means for everyday Americans. Chloe, 39 trillion is almost hard to wrap your head around.
It really is, Grace. U.S. Treasury data puts the exact figure at just over $39 trillion, $16 billion as of Monday. To give that some perspective, the debt was at $37 trillion back in mid-August and crossed $38 trillion in late October. ABC News and the Seattle Times both reported on that pace, and what's striking is the jump from 38 to 39 trillion took only about 21 weeks.
So it's picking up speed. How much are we actually adding each day?
Michael Peterson, who runs the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, told KIRO 7 News Seattle that the country is piling on between $5 billion and $7 billion in new debt every single day. At that rate, analysts are now projecting we'll blow past $40 trillion before the fall elections. Some even think it could happen before the fiscal year ends on September 30th. That next milestone isn't some far-off worry anymore. It's potentially months away.
And a huge part of what's driving this right now is the war in Iran. What do we know about the costs so far?
Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th, so we're less than 3 weeks in. White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett has acknowledged the conflict has already cost more than $12 billion. Fox Business and The Washington Post reported that the opening phase alone involved nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours, hitting nuclear facilities and air defenses across the country. The sheer volume of munitions being used is a big part of why the price tag is climbing so fast.
900 strikes in 12 hours. What are the Pentagon's stated objectives here?
Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Pentagon leadership have outlined 4 main goals. They want to dismantle Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, destroy the Iranian Navy, ensure what they call permanent nuclear denial, and sever the networks connecting Iran to its terrorist proxies. Israel is partnering on this under the codename Operation Roaring Lion. Those are enormous military objectives, and each one carries a massive financial commitment.
And I understand the Pentagon's already asking Congress for a huge new funding package.
That's right, the Pentagon has submitted an emergency supplemental request for more than $200 billion. A big chunk of that is to replenish what they call exquisite munitions, things like Tomahawk cruise missiles and Patriot interceptors. These weapons are being used faster than manufacturers can replace them, which is a logistics problem and a budget problem at the same time. Analysts from CSIS, cited by Times Online, estimated the first 100 hours of the operation alone cost roughly $3.7 billion, with most of that going to unbudgeted munitions.
So there's no way this was baked into the existing defense budget. Meanwhile, the White House has been touting deficit reduction. What's the story there?
This is where it gets really interesting. White House spokesman Kush Desai and the Department of Government Efficiency, known as DOGE, have claimed a $41 billion reduction in the federal deficit for fiscal year 2025. They've credited what they call right-sizing the government, cutting federal employment to its lowest level since 1966, plus an aggressive crackdown on welfare fraud. On the surface, that sounds like real progress.
But nonpartisan groups aren't buying it?
Not entirely. The Congressional Budget Office, the Government Accountability Office, and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget all looked at the numbers. They confirmed the deficit did shrink from about $1.82 trillion in fiscal 2024 to $1.78 trillion in 2025. But they attribute that decline to very different factors than what the White House is claiming. The math tells a more complicated story.
Walk us through what those organizations found.
The biggest factor was tariff revenue. Customs duties surged by $118 billion in fiscal 2025, a 153% increase thanks to new trade policies. That's a massive influx of cash that had nothing to do with workforce cuts. On top of that, there was a one-time $131 billion downward re-estimate of the federal student loan portfolio after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The CBO called that an accounting maneuver, not structural savings. So two of the largest drivers of the deficit shrinking were essentially a tariff windfall and a bookkeeping adjustment.
And what about interest on the debt itself? That's been a growing concern for years.
It's now enormous. The CBO noted that net interest costs on existing debt surpassed $1 trillion for the first time in 2025. Think about that. We're now paying more in interest alone than the entire national defense budget. It's become a self-sustaining engine of debt. You borrow to cover your obligations, and the interest on that borrowing creates new obligations. That cycle is extremely hard to break, especially when you're simultaneously funding a major military campaign.
And the workforce reductions the administration's been promoting, did those actually save money?
A Senate minority investigation and the Partnership for Public Service looked into this. They found that the so-called right-sizing efforts generated about $14.8 billion in deferred resignation payments and significant legal costs. That largely offset whatever savings came from reducing the number of federal employees. So the headline number the White House uses is real. But the explanation for why it happened doesn't line up with the administration's narrative.
Let's talk about the global ripple effects. The war has obviously shaken energy markets.
Shaken is an understatement. PBS, the Houston Chronicle, and the Economic Times have all reported on the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, which normally handles about 20% of the world's oil supply. The U.S. asked China to help secure the strait, and Beijing essentially said no. They've adopted what they're calling strategic neutrality, urging a cessation of hostilities while sending humanitarian aid to Tehran. Without Chinese cooperation, the strait is effectively closed to normal traffic.
What has that done to oil prices?
Brent crude has spiked roughly 40%, crossing into the $100 to $110 per barrel range. Some economists are warning it could peak at $170 if the closure drags on. For drivers here in the U.S., that's already translated into a 23.6% hike in gasoline prices at the pump as of mid-March. And we're still in the early weeks of this conflict, so there's real concern that prices haven't peaked yet.
That kind of oil shock has to be feeding into broader inflation worries.
It absolutely is. Oxford Economics and Deloitte are warning that the energy shock is pushing U.S. inflation expectations up to 3.3%. That's significant because it likely forces the Federal Reserve to pause any planned interest rate cuts, so borrowing costs stay elevated, GDP growth slows for the rest of 2026, and the economic outlook gets cloudier. It's a cascading effect that starts with the war but touches almost every corner of the economy.
So what does $39 trillion actually mean for a typical American family?
The GAO and advocacy groups like Epic for America have done the math. The debt now works out to roughly $289,000 per U.S. household. Obviously, no one's getting a bill in the mail, but the consequences are very real. Mortgage rates and auto loan rates are climbing because the government is competing for capital in the bond market. Businesses have less room to invest in expansion or raise wages. And the inflationary pressure from war-driven oil spikes is making everyday goods and services more expensive.
Is there any sign this trajectory changes anytime soon?
Not based on current projections. The CBO estimates the 2025 Reconciliation Act will add $4.7 trillion to the cumulative deficit over the next decade. With the war ongoing and no clear end date, military spending will keep climbing. That $40 trillion milestone could arrive in a matter of months, and it's shaping up to be a defining issue heading into the fall elections. Fiscal hawks on both sides of the aisle are sounding alarms, but right now the political bandwidth is consumed by the conflict.
Chloe, really thorough reporting on all of this. Thank you for breaking it down.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Senator Markwayne Mullin is currently mulling over his future as the next Secretary of Homeland Security. During his confirmation hearing on Wednesday, March 18, 2026, the Oklahoma Republican faced appalling amount of scrutiny from Chairman Rand Paul, who questioned his temperament and passed verbal jabs at colleagues. While Mullen received some brotherly love and bipartisan praise from Senator John Fetterman for his professionalism, he had to dodge questions about a secret overseas trip that was missing from his FBI records. This missing baggage forced the committee into a secure facility for a closed-door briefing to resolve the discrepancy before today's scheduled vote. If confirmed to replace the ousted Kristi Noem, Mullen has pledged to warrant some respect by requiring ICE agents to obtain judicial warrants before entering homes or businesses. This leadership change comes as the department remains in a state of TSA catastrophe. A partial shutdown has lasted 35 days, leading to a 55% absence rate among agents in Houston and causing national travel delays to take flight. Over at the Department of Justice, things are getting a bit blanche. House Democrats, led by Representatives Robert Garcia and Maxwell Frost, staged a high-profile walkout from a closed-door briefing yesterday. They were hoping to get the scoop on the Jeffrey Epstein investigative files. But Attorney General Pam Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche reportedly gave them the cold shoulder. Bondi refused to provide an opening statement or testify under oath, and she wouldn't commit to honoring a subpoena, leading lawmakers to Bondi leave the room in frustration. This escalating standoff adds another layer of mystery to the administration's alleged data blackout. As critics argue, the government is keeping everyone in the dark regarding federal records and deportation figures. In international news, Iran is currently tangled in a web of silence as a near-total internet blackout enters its 20th consecutive day. Connectivity is hovering at a measly 1% of normal levels, leaving 90 million people disconnected from the global conversation. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi defended the digital darkness as a security measure following military strikes that have claimed over 1,300 lives. While the government has implemented a whitelisting system for its chosen users, civilians caught using satellite services like Starlink are finding themselves in a galaxy of legal trouble. This blackout isn't just silencing dissent, it's also draining the economy to the tune of $35.7 million every single day. Back on domestic soil, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is being accused of trying to get into the genes of the protest movement. Under Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota, ICE agents have reportedly been collecting DNA samples from protesters and legal observers. This genetic dragnet stems from a leaked January memo aiming to build a database of agitators. Although a federal judge issued a preliminary injunction to stop retaliatory arrests, the continued collection of biological data has civil rights groups concerned that the government is trying to unzip the First Amendment rights of peaceful activists. Finally, the situation in northern Moldova is anything but fluid. Tens of thousands of residents are currently without running water after a Russian strike on a Ukrainian hydroelectric plant on March 7th sent tons of petroleum into the Dniester River. This oil-slicked disaster has contaminated 80% of Moldova's freshwater supply, forcing a 15-day environmental state of alert. Water services in Balti, Soroka, Floresti, and Singare remain suspended until pollutant levels drop to 0.1 milligrams per liter. While Prime Minister Alexandru Munteanu says the tide is turning, the military is currently deploying tankers to keep the population afloat until the river runs clear again. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.